Sarah Martinez had dreamed of flying since she was 7 years old, watching military jets streak across the desert sky near her grandmother's house in Nevada. The roar of engines and the precision of formation flying captured her imagination in a way nothing else ever had. 23 years later, she stood at the entrance of Air Force Base, her flight suit crisp and her determination unwavering, ready to begin her career as a combat pilot. The moment she walked into the squadron briefing room, the conversation stopped. 28 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and she could feel the weight of their stares. She was the only woman in the 428th Fighter Squadron, and everyone knew it. The silence stretched uncomfortably before someone coughed and the chatter resumed, but the damage was done. She was different, and they wanted her to know it. Captain Jake, a veteran pilot with 12 years of experience, was the first to approach her after the briefing. His smile seemed friendly enough, but his words carried an edge. "So you're our new pilot," he said, looking her up and down. "Hope you can handle the pressure better than the last female pilot they sent us. She washed out in 3 weeks. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her jaw tightened slightly. She had heard variations of this comment throughout her training, and she knew it wouldn't be the last time. Squadron Commander, Colonel Richards, assigned her the call sign Angel-01 during her 2nd week. The room erupted in snickers when he announced it. "Perfect for our little angel," whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe she can pray us out of trouble when things get tough." The laughter that followed felt like needles against her skin, but Sarah simply nodded and accepted the call sign without comment. She had learned long ago that reacting to their taunts would only fuel their fire. Her first training missions were technically sound but unremarkable. She followed protocols, executed maneuvers correctly, and landed safely every time. But her fellow pilots weren't impressed by competence. They were looking for something more, something that would prove she belonged among them. After each flight, she would hear the whispered conversations in the locker room, the casual dismissals of her abilities, the jokes about her call sign. Angel-01 is flying like she's afraid to break her nails, one pilot commented after a particularly cautious training run. The real test came during a complex night training exercise over the Nevada desert. Sarah was flying as wingman 2, who had reluctantly accepted her assignment to his flight. The mission involved low-level navigation through a series of waypoints, simulating a strike mission behind enemy lines. As they approached the 3rd waypoint's radio crackled to life. "Angel-01, try to keep up. This isn't Sunday driving." His tone was condescending, but Sarah bit back her response and maintained her position. 20 minutes into the flight's aircraft experienced what appeared to be engine trouble. His radio calls became urgent as warning lights illuminated his cockpit. "I'm losing power," he reported to the tower. "Attempting to restart." Sarah watched from her position 200 feet away as his aircraft began to lose altitude. The desert floor rushed up toward them, dark and unforgiving under the moonless sky. This was no longer a training exercise. This was an emergency. Without hesitation, Sarah moved into a protective position above troubled aircraft. She radioed the tower with their exact coordinates and current status, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Tower, this is Angel-01. Warrior 03 is experiencing engine failure at Angels 5, requesting immediate assistance and emergency vectors to nearest suitable landing site." Her training took over completely, every lesson about emergency procedures flooding back with crystal clarity. The tower controller's voice came back immediately. "Angel-01, copy your transmission. Emergency crews are being scrambled. Continue to monitor Warrior 03 and provide assistance as needed." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and moved even closer to his aircraft, close enough to see into his cockpit. Through his canopy, she could see him working frantically with his controls, sweat visible on his face even in the dim cockpit lighting. "What's your status?" she called over the radio. His response was tight with stress. "I can't get a restart. Fuel pressure is dropping, and I'm getting multiple warning indicators. I might have to punch out." The idea of ejection over the dark desert was dangerous enough, but his aircraft was loaded with training ordnance that would make the situation even more hazardous. Sarah knew she had to act quickly. She positioned her aircraft to provide a navigation reference for and began talking him through an emergency landing procedure she had memorized but never hoped to use. Her voice remained steady and reassuring as she guided him toward a small auxiliary airfield 40 miles to the south. "Follow my lead," she told him. "I'll take you in nice and easy. Just focus on my lights and maintain glide slope." For the next 20 minutes, she became his eyes and ears, coaching him through the most dangerous flight of his career. The landing was rough but successful. aircraft touched down hard on the emergency strip, bounced twice, and rolled to a stop just short of the overrun area. Emergency vehicles surrounded his aircraft within minutes, but he was unharmed. As Sarah circled overhead, waiting for confirmation that he was safe, she felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. She had done her job exactly as she had been trained to do it. The mockery and dismissive comments seemed less important now, overshadowed by the reality of what had just happened. The squadron briefing room was unusually quiet the next morning. Word of the previous night's emergency had spread throughout the base, and everyone knew that Angel-01 had played a crucial role in bringing home safely. Sarah walked in expecting some acknowledgement, perhaps even a grudging word of thanks, but the atmosphere remained cold and unwelcoming. Sat in his usual spot, his arm in a sling from a minor injury sustained during his hard landing, but his eyes avoided hers completely. Colonel Richards began the briefing with a perfunctory mention of the previous night's incident. "Good job bringing Warrior 03 home, Angel-01, he said without looking up from his notes. The comment was brief and matter-of-fact, lacking any real emotion or recognition. Several pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual, loaded with unspoken tension and complicated emotions. After the briefing, Sarah found herself alone in the hallway with Captain Lisa, one of the intelligence officers who worked closely with the squadron. Lisa had been watching the dynamics within the unit for months and had grown increasingly concerned about the treatment Sarah received. "You know what you did last night was exceptional," Lisa said quietly. "I've seen the preliminary reports. You quite possibly saved his life." Sarah appreciated the words, but they felt hollow against the wall of indifference she faced from her fellow pilots. The real blow came during lunch when she overheard talking to a group of pilots near the vending machines. "Sure, she followed procedure," he was saying. "Any pilot worth their wings should be able to do that. It's not like she performed a miracle out there." His words stung more than any direct insult could have. She had risked her own safety to help him, had used every skill she possessed to guide him to safety, and his response was to minimize her actions to mere procedure following. That afternoon brought a new challenge when Sarah was assigned to lead a four-ship formation exercise. It was her first time as flight leader, a responsibility that typically came with significant respect from squadron mates. Instead, she faced subtle resistance from the three pilots assigned to her flight. Captain Davis, flying as her number 2, made several sarcastic comments during the pre-flight briefing about following Angel orders. His tone was just unprofessional enough to be offensive, but not quite enough to warrant official complaint. The formation exercise itself went well technically. Sarah led her flight through a series of complex maneuvers over the training range, demonstrating solid leadership skills and excellent flying ability. Her radio calls were crisp and professional, her timing was perfect, and her formation maintained tight discipline throughout the exercise. But when they returned to base, the debrief session became an exercise in passive aggression and subtle undermining. "The lead aircraft seemed a bit tentative on the third maneuver," Davis commented during the debrief. "Maybe we could have been more aggressive with the altitude changes." His criticism was technically valid but nitpicking, the kind of minor complaint that would never have been raised against a male flight leader. Sarah responded professionally, acknowledging the feedback while internally noting that Davis had made several positioning errors of his own during the flight. The pattern continued for weeks. No matter what Sarah accomplished, no matter how professionally she performed, there was always some way for her squadron mates to diminish her achievements. When she scored highest on a written exam about emergency procedures, someone joked that she must have studied extra hard to compensate for her lack of natural flying ability. When she executed a particularly difficult landing in challenging crosswinds, another pilot commented that she had probably just gotten lucky. The psychological toll was beginning to show. Sarah found herself second-guessing decisions that should have been automatic, overthinking maneuvers she could perform in her sleep. The constant criticism and dismissal were eroding her confidence in ways that direct hostility might not have. She began avoiding the squadron's social areas, eating lunch alone, and spending her free time in the base library rather than trying to integrate with her peers. 3 months into her assignment, the squadron received word that they would be participating in a major training exercise called Red Flag, a large-scale combat simulation held at Air Force Base. Red Flag was considered the most realistic and challenging training exercise in the Air Force, involving hundreds of aircraft and simulating complex combat scenarios. For many pilots, it represented the pinnacle of their training experience, and a chance to prove themselves against the best aviators from around the world. The news of red flag participation sent a buzz of excitement through the squadron. Pilots who had been through the exercise before shared stories of its intensity and complexity with those who would be attending for the first time. Sarah listened to their conversations from the periphery, both excited about the opportunity and apprehensive about facing the challenges of red flag, while still dealing with the ongoing hostility within her own unit. Colonel Richards announced the flight assignments for red flag during a squadron meeting the following week. Sarah's heart sank when she realized she had been assigned to fly as wingman in a four-ship flight led by. The irony was not lost on her. The man whose life she had helped save would now be responsible for leading her through the most challenging exercise of her career. His expression when the assignments were announced suggested he was no more pleased with the arrangement than she was. The preparation for red flag intensified over the following weeks. Mission briefs became more detailed and complex, simulating the kind of multi-threat environment pilots might face in actual combat. Sarah threw herself into the preparation, studying threat assessments, memorizing target locations, and rehearsing emergency procedures until they became second nature. She was determined to perform flawlessly during the exercise, knowing that any mistake would be amplified and used as evidence of her inadequacy. During one particularly intensive briefing about surface-to-air missile threats, Sarah noticed something troubling in the intelligence reports. The simulated enemy forces would be using a new type of radar system that could potentially track aircraft using flight profiles similar to those her squadron typically employed. She spent hours analyzing the data and developing alternative approach patterns that might reduce their vulnerability to detection. When she presented her analysis to during the next day's flight briefing, his response was dismissive. "These intel reports always make things sound worse than they are," he said with a wave of his hand. "We'll stick with standard approach patterns. No need to overcomplicate things." Sarah pressed her point, explaining the technical details of the new radar system and how it might affect their mission success, but had already made up his mind. The other pilots in the flight nodded along with their leader, showing no interest in her tactical insights. Red flag began with a complexity that took even experienced pilots by surprise. The exercise area stretched across thousands of square miles of Nevada desert, populated with sophisticated radar systems, surface-to-air missile simulators, and aggressor aircraft flown by some of the most skilled pilots in the world. Sarah's squadron was tasked with striking a heavily defended target complex while avoiding detection and interception by a formidable enemy air defense network. The first mission launched at dawn on a Tuesday morning. This four-ship flight was part of a larger strike package that included electronic warfare aircraft, aerial refueling tankers, and fighter escorts. As they climbed out from Air Force Base into the brightening desert sky, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with complex military flying. Despite the tensions within her flight, she was eager to prove herself in this ultimate test of pilot skill. Led the flight along a route that followed standard tactical procedures, maintaining radio silence while navigating toward their assigned target area. Sarah flew in the number 4 position, following the flight's movements while constantly scanning the sky for threats. Her radar warning receiver remained quiet for the first 30 minutes of flight, suggesting they had successfully avoided detection by the simulated enemy radar network. The trouble began when they reached the initial point for their attack run. Its planned approach took them directly through an area that Sarah had identified during her intelligence analysis as particularly dangerous. As they descended toward their attack altitude, her radar warning receiver suddenly came alive with threat indications. Multiple surface-to-air missile systems had detected their formation and were preparing to engage. "Warrior Flight, we have multiple SAM launches," called over the radio, his voice tight with sudden stress. "Break left, break left." The 4 aircraft scattered as simulated missiles streaked toward their positions. In the chaos of defensive maneuvering, Sarah found herself separated from the rest of the flight, alone in hostile airspace with enemy fighters closing in from the north. Her training took over as she maneuvered aggressively to avoid the simulated threats while trying to rejoin her flight. The G-forces pressed her deep into her ejection seat as she pulled her aircraft through a series of high-speed turns. Through her headset, she could hear the increasingly frantic radio calls from the other members of her flight as they struggled to deal with the multiple threats converging on their position. "Angel-01, where are you?" called out, his usual composure cracking under pressure. "I've lost visual on you." Sarah was currently inverted, pulling through a split-S maneuver to avoid a simulated air-to-air missile shot from an aggressor F-16. "I'm defensive 2 miles south of the target," she responded between grunts caused by the G-forces. Multiple threats engaging. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed for months afterward. While maneuvering to avoid the simulated threats, Sarah noticed something that the exercise controllers had not anticipated. The aggressor pilots, in their enthusiasm to create a realistic threat environment, had positioned themselves in a way that blocked the primary escape route for any aircraft that might be shot down during the exercise. If a pilot had to eject over this particular area, they would be in serious danger from the high concentration of aircraft maneuvering at high speed and low altitude. Sarah immediately recognized the safety hazard and made a split-second decision that went against established exercise protocol. Instead of continuing her defensive maneuvering, she broke out of the exercise scenario and climbed to a safe altitude while calling out the dangerous situation over the emergency frequency. "Emergency, emergency, this is Angel-01. We have a serious safety hazard in Sector 7. Multiple aircraft converging on potential ejection area." The exercise controllers acknowledged her call and immediately ordered all aircraft in the area to climb to safe altitudes while they assessed the situation. The elaborate scenario that had been months in the planning came to an abrupt halt as safety officers rushed to analyze the aircraft positions and confirm the hazard Sarah had identified. For 20 tense minutes, dozens of aircraft circled at high altitude while the situation was evaluated and resolved. When the all-clear was finally given and the exercise resumed, Sarah found herself facing a difficult choice. Flight had continued toward their target without her, operating as a 3-ship formation instead of the planned 4-ship. She could attempt to rejoin them, but doing so would require flying through the same dangerous area where the safety hazard had occurred. Alternatively, she could abort the mission and return to base, a decision that would be seen as a failure by her squadron mates. Sarah chose a third option that demonstrated both her tactical thinking and her determination to complete the mission. Using the alternative approach route she had developed during her intelligence analysis, she proceeded toward the target area alone, taking a longer but safer path that avoided the most heavily defended areas. Flying solo made her more vulnerable to enemy fighters, but it also made her harder to detect on radar due to her smaller formation signature. Her solo approach worked perfectly. Whilst 3-ship formations struggled with the heavy defenses along the standard route, Sarah slipped through the radar coverage using terrain masking and careful timing. She reached the target area ahead of the rest of her flight and was able to provide crucial intelligence about enemy positions and defenses. Once battered formation finally arrived at the target, they found that Angel-01 had already identified the highest priority targets and was ready to coordinate a much more effective attack. The strike mission was ultimately successful, with all primary targets destroyed and all aircraft returning safely to base. During the post-mission debrief, the exercise controllers praised the innovative tactics that had allowed the mission to succeed despite the initial setbacks. Sarah's quick thinking in identifying the safety hazard had prevented a potentially serious accident, while her solo navigation to the target had provided intelligence that proved crucial to mission success. However, the reaction from her own squadron was mixed at best. While Colonel Richards acknowledged her contributions to the mission's success, several pilots expressed concern about her decision to break from established procedure during the safety emergency. Was particularly critical, suggesting that her actions had disrupted the exercise unnecessarily and that a more experienced pilot would have found a way to continue the mission without calling attention to the safety issue. The criticism stung, but Sarah was beginning to understand something important about her situation. No matter what she accomplished, no matter how skillfully she performed, there would always be those who found ways to minimize her achievements or question her decisions. The realization was both discouraging and liberating. Discouraging because it meant the hostility might never completely end, but liberating because it freed her from the impossible task of trying to win universal approval. Second day of Red Flag brought an even more challenging scenario. Sarah's flight was tasked with providing close air support for ground forces engaged in a simulated battle deep in enemy territory. The mission required precise coordination between air and ground units, split-second timing, and the ability to distinguish between friendly and enemy forces in a chaotic combat environment. It was exactly the kind of mission where mistakes could have catastrophic consequences in real combat. Briefed the mission with his usual confidence, but Sarah noticed several gaps in his planning that concerned her. The timing for their arrival over the battlefield was extremely tight, leaving little margin for error if they encountered unexpected delays or threats. Additionally, the backup communication procedures seemed inadequate for a scenario where radio jamming was expected to be heavy. Once again, she attempted to raise her concerns during the briefing, and once again, her input was dismissed as overcomplicated second-guessing. The close air support mission began with ominous signs that Sarah's concerns had been well-founded. Heavy electronic jamming from simulated enemy forces disrupted radio communications almost immediately after takeoff, forcing the flight to rely on backup frequencies and hand signals for coordination. This carefully planned timeline began falling apart before they even reached the combat area, as unexpected weather delays and rerouting around restricted airspace ate into their already tight schedule. By the time they approached the simulated battlefield, they were running 12 minutes behind schedule. In a real combat situation, this delay could mean the difference between life and death for the ground forces depending on their air support. Sarah could see the tension in his body language as he struggled to compress the mission timeline while maintaining safety margins. The radio chatter from the ground controllers was becoming increasingly urgent as the simulated enemy forces pressed their attack. "Warrior Flight, this is Groundhog 6, came the strained voice of the ground controller. "We need immediate close air support on grid reference 340-5678. Enemy armor is advancing on our position, and we're taking heavy casualties." Acknowledged the call and began coordinating the attack, but Sarah could see that the situation was more complex than their pre-mission briefing had anticipated. Multiple friendly units were scattered across the battlefield, making target identification extremely difficult. As the flight approached the target area, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The coordinates provided by the ground controller didn't match what she was seeing on her targeting display. According to her navigation system, friendly forces were located much closer to the target area than the ground controller had indicated. If proceeded with the planned attack profile, there was a significant risk of accidentally engaging friendly units instead of enemy forces. "Warrior Lead, this is Angel-01, she called over the radio, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. "I'm showing friendly positions much closer to the target than briefed. Recommend we abort this attack run and get better target confirmation." Response was sharp and immediate. "Negative, Angel-01. Ground controller has positive identification of enemy forces. We're proceeding with the attack as planned." The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Led the flight into the attack while Sarah desperately tried to reconcile the conflicting information on her displays. Through her targeting pod, she could see armored vehicles in the target area, but their identification markings were unclear due to dust and distance. The ground controller continued calling for immediate strikes, but something about the situation felt wrong to her experienced pilot instincts. At the last possible moment, just as was about to release his weapons, Sarah made a decision that would define her career. She broke from the formation and climbed to a higher altitude where her sensors could get a clearer view of the battlefield. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The vehicles in the target area were displaying friendly identification symbols that were visible only from directly above. The ground controller had made a critical error in target identification. break off," Sarah called urgently over the radio. "Those are friendly forces in the target area. I repeat, friendly forces in the target area." Her transmission cut through the chaos of combat communications like a knife. Already committed to his attack run, had only seconds to decide whether to trust his wingman's assessment or proceed with the mission as planned. The exercise controllers later said that its decision to abort the attack based on Sarah's warning prevented what would have been scored as a catastrophic friendly fire incident. The ground controller's error in target identification was confirmed during the post-mission analysis, validating Sarah's split-second assessment of the situation. In real combat, her actions would have saved the lives of an entire friendly armor platoon. But the immediate aftermath of the mission brought no celebration or recognition. Was furious about what he saw as insubordination during a critical phase of the mission. During the flight back to base, his radio calls to Sarah were curt and professional, but she could hear the anger underlying his words. The other pilots in the flight remained silent, uncertain about what they had witnessed and reluctant to take sides in what was clearly becoming a serious conflict. The post-mission debrief was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of Sarah's military career. The exercise controllers praised her quick thinking and accurate threat assessment, nodding that her actions had prevented a major training incident that could have resulted in negative scores for the entire squadron. However, several senior pilots questioned whether she had followed proper procedures in breaking from the formation without explicit permission from the flight leader. Colonel Richards found himself in a difficult position. Officially, Sarah had performed exactly as she should have, identifying a critical safety issue and taking immediate action to prevent disaster. Unofficially, her actions had highlighted serious weaknesses in the squadron's planning and execution that reflected poorly on the unit's leadership. The tension in the briefing room was thick enough to cut with a knife, as various factions debated the implications of what had occurred. Angel-01 showed good situational awareness and probably prevented a serious incident, the lead exercise controller stated matter-of-factly. Her actions were consistent with established safety protocols and demonstrated sound judgment under pressure. The words should have been cause for celebration, but Sarah could see the resentment in the eyes of several squadron members who seemed to view her success as somehow diminishing their own accomplishments. The breaking point came during an informal gathering at the officers' club that evening. Sarah had initially planned to avoid the social event, knowing that her reception would likely be chilly at best. However, Captain convinced her that avoiding her squadron mates would only make the situation worse. "You can't let them drive you into isolation," Lisa argued. "You've proven yourself twice now in critical situations. It's time to stand your ground." The atmosphere at the officers' club was tense from the moment Sarah walked through the door. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as she approached various groups, and she could feel the weight of hostile stares from across the room. She ordered a soda and found a seat at the bar, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. For a while, it seemed like the evening might pass without incident. The confrontation began when Captain Davis, emboldened by several drinks, decided to voice what many in the squadron were thinking. "Must be nice to be the hero all the time," he said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Some of us have been flying combat missions for years without needing to show off." His words carried the bitter edge of resentment and professional jealousy. Sarah turned to face him directly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not trying to be a hero, Davis. I'm trying to do my job safely and effectively, the same job we're all trained to do." Her response was measured and professional, but it only seemed to inflame the situation further. Other pilots began gathering around, sensing that the long-simmering tensions were finally coming to a head. Who had been drinking steadily since arriving at the club, suddenly stood up and pointed an accusatory finger at Sarah. "Your job is to follow orders and support your flight leader," he said, his words slightly slurred but his meaning crystal clear. "Not to second-guess every decision and grandstand for the exercise controllers." The room fell silent as everyone waited to see how Sarah would respond to this direct challenge to her competence and loyalty. Sarah stood up slowly, meeting his angry stare with quiet dignity. The officers' club had gone completely silent, with every pilot in the room watching to see how this confrontation would unfold. She could feel the weight of months of accumulated resentment and professional jealousy pressing down on her, but she also felt something else, a clarity that came from knowing she had done the right thing regardless of the personal cost. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "My job is to follow orders, but it's also to keep my fellow pilots alive and complete the mission safely. When those two responsibilities conflict, I'll choose keeping people alive every single time." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront the uncomfortable reality of what military service actually meant. His face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You think you're better than the rest of us," he accused, his voice rising. "Always finding problems with other people's plans, always having to be the smart one who saves the day. We managed just fine before you got here, and we'll manage just fine after you're gone." The venom in his words was unmistakable, and several pilots shifted uncomfortably as they watched their respected colleague expose his bitter resentment. Before Sarah could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see Colonel Richards standing in the doorway of the officers' club, his expression stern and disappointed. He had clearly heard enough of the confrontation to understand what was happening, and his presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room. "Captain, I think you've had enough to drink for one evening. I suggest you call it a night." Looked like he wanted to argue, but the colonel's tone brooked no disagreement. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and stormed out of the club, muttering under his breath about favoritism and political correctness. Several other pilots followed him, their loyalty to their longtime colleague overriding any sense of fairness or professional courtesy. Sarah found herself standing alone in the middle of the room, feeling more isolated than ever. Colonel Richards approached her with a measured expression. "Lieutenant Martinez, I think we need to have a conversation. My office first thing tomorrow morning." His tone was neutral, giving no indication of whether she was in trouble or being called in for some other reason. Sarah nodded acknowledgement and decided it was time to leave the club. As she walked toward the door, she heard the buzz of conversation resume behind her, but she didn't look back. The next morning's meeting with Colonel Richards proved to be a turning point in more ways than one. The colonel began by reviewing the events of the past several months, including Sarah's emergency assistance too, her tactical innovations during Red Flag, and her prevention of the friendly fire incident. His analysis was thorough and professional, focusing on facts rather than personalities or squadron politics. "Lieutenant Martinez," he began, setting down a thick file folder, "I'm going to be direct with you. You've demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment in several critical situations. Your actions have quite possibly saved lives and prevented serious accidents. At the same time, I'm aware that your integration into this squadron has been challenging, and that's partly my responsibility as commanding officer." Sarah listened carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. Colonel Richards continued, "I've received orders to forward your name for consideration for the Thunderbirds demonstration team. Your flying skills, technical knowledge, and performance under pressure have caught the attention of some very senior people. The question is whether you're interested in pursuing that opportunity." The Thunderbirds represented the pinnacle of Air Force flying, an elite demonstration team that performed at air shows around the world. Being selected for the team was an honor that few pilots ever achieved, and it would effectively end the current phase of Sarah's career while opening doors to opportunities she had never dared imagine. The irony was not lost on her. The same skills that had made her unwelcome in her current squadron were exactly what the Thunderbirds were looking for. "Sir, I'm honored by the consideration," Sarah replied carefully. "But I have to ask, is this transfer being recommended because of my performance, or because it would solve a personnel problem for the squadron?" It was a risky question to ask so directly, but she needed to understand the true motivation behind the opportunity. Colonel Richards smiled for the first time since she had known him. "That's exactly the kind of direct thinking that got you recommended in the first place. The answer is both, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You're an exceptional pilot who deserves better opportunities than you're getting here. At the same time, your presence has created tensions that aren't healthy for unit cohesion. Sometimes the right answer is to move a good person to a place where they can thrive." 3 months later, Sarah found herself at Air Force Base preparing for her first performance with the Thunderbirds demonstration team. The selection process had been grueling, involving intensive flying evaluations, psychological assessments, and interviews with senior commanders. She had competed against dozens of highly qualified pilots from across the Air Force, but her combination of technical skill and demonstrated performance under pressure had set her apart from the competition. The transition to demonstration flying required learning an entirely different set of skills. Instead of tactical formations designed for combat effectiveness, she now flew precise aerobatic maneuvers intended to showcase the capabilities of Air Force aircraft to civilian audiences. The margin for error was essentially zero, with aircraft flying within feet of each other at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Every movement had to be perfectly coordinated, every maneuver executed with flawless timing. Her new squadron mates in the Thunderbirds were a different breed from the pilots she had left behind. They had been selected not only for their flying abilities, but also for their professionalism and ability to work as part of a team. Competition existed, but it was channeled into pursuit of collective excellence rather than individual dominance. For the first time since joining the Air Force, Sarah felt like she truly belonged. The first air show performance was scheduled for a weekend in Arizona, with Sarah flying as Thunderbird 6 in the team's signature diamond formation. As she taxied her F-16 toward the runway for takeoff, she could see thousands of spectators gathered on the flight line, many of them children who dreamed of flying just as she once had. The responsibility of representing the Air Force to these future aviators was not lost on her. "Tower, this is Thunderbird 6 ready for takeoff," she called over the radio as she aligned her aircraft on the runway center line. The voice that responded was crisp and professional, but there was something different in the tone, a note of respect that she had rarely heard during her previous assignments. "Thunderbird 6, you are cleared for takeoff. Show them what you can do." As Sarah advanced the throttle and felt her aircraft accelerate down the runway, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The mockery and dismissal she had endured seemed like distant memories now, overwhelmed by the reality of what she had accomplished. She was no longer just Angel-01, the female pilot who had to prove herself worthy of acceptance. She was Thunderbird 6, representing the best of what military aviation could achieve. The performance that day was flawless. Sarah and her teammates executed their routine with precision that drew gasps and applause from the crowd below. Children pointed excitedly at the aircraft as they flashed overhead in perfect formation, their dreams taking shape before their eyes. After landing, Sarah was surrounded by young fans asking for autographs and photos, many of them young girls who saw in her a possibility they had never considered before. Later that evening, as she reviewed the day's performance with her team, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was from Captain Lisa, calling to congratulate her on the air show and to share some news from her old squadron. "Put in for a transfer to a training unit," Lisa reported. "Rumor has it that he finally realized he was the problem, not you. Colonel Richards retired early, but his replacement has made it clear that professional behavior is expected from everyone, regardless of gender." What? The conversation was brief, but it provided a satisfying sense of closure to a difficult chapter in Sarah's career. The pilots who had made her life miserable were moving on to other assignments, while she was soaring to heights they would never achieve. Justice had not come through confrontation or official complaints, but through the simple demonstration of excellence that could not be ignored or diminished. Years later, when Sarah was asked to speak at the Air Force Academy about overcoming adversity and pursuing excellence, she would reflect on the lessons learned during those challenging months. The mockery and hostility she had faced had been painful, but they had also forged a strength and determination that served her well throughout her career. She had learned that some battles cannot be won through direct confrontation, but only through the persistent demonstration of competence and character. "They mocked my call sign," she would tell the young cadets in her audience, until the moment when that call sign became associated with excellence rather than gender. Angel-01 was supposed to be a joke, but it became a symbol of what's possible when you refuse to let other people's limitations define your own potential.